The door slammed behind her as the man inside shouted, "I won't build a future on something that ends with you." And out in the cold street, a cowboy waited without stepping closer. So why hadn't he left too? Nora didn't turn back. The wind dragged dust across the wooden steps as she picked up her worn leather bag, fingers steady, though her breath wasn't. Across the road, Gideon Hale stood beside his horse, watching, not moving, not calling her name. Inside the house, voices rose again, sharp enough to cut through the boards, but she stepped down anyway. When she reached him, she didn't ask for help. She just looked up and said, quiet and clear, "If you still want me, you need to know the truth." Gideon's hand tightened once on the reins, but he didn't answer. "Stay with me for a moment. Tell me, what would you do if you were standing where she is now?" The wind came down the length of Main Street like it had something to prove, kicking up dust that scraped along the wooden fronts and slipped through every loose crack it could find. Dry Creek had already shut its doors for the night. Lamps burned low behind curtains. The saloon piano had gone quiet an hour ago. Nora Whitfield stood on the narrow porch of a house that didn't belong to her anymore. Her bag sat at her feet. Small, worn leather. The kind a person packs when they already know there's nowhere else to go. Inside, voices carried through the door, sharp at first, then duller, like someone had turned their back and decided the matter was finished. "You should have told me sooner. I told you what mattered. What matters is a family, a future. I won't build a life on something that can't give me that." Nora didn't move. Her hand rested lightly on the railing, fingers steady despite the wind tugging at her sleeve. She had heard enough men speak in that tone to know when a decision had already been made. Then came the words, louder this time, meant to be heard through the wood. "A woman who can't bear children has no place in my family." The latch clicked behind her. No one opened the door again. For a moment, the street stretched empty in front of her. Dust drifted past her boots. Somewhere down the road, a loose sign creaked against its chain. Then she noticed him. A horse stood near the edge of the road, head low against the wind. Beside it, a man waited. Gideon Hale didn't lean, didn't shift his weight. He stood straight, one hand resting near the reins, hat pulled low. Even in the dim light, he looked large. Broad shoulders filling out a coat worn thin at the edges, boots planted like he had no intention of moving unless he chose to. He hadn't stepped onto the porch, hadn't knocked, just waited. Nora bent, picked up her bag and stepped down. The wood creaked once under her weight. She didn't look back at the door. There was nothing behind it that would change. The wind caught her dress as she crossed the yard. Gravel shifted under her boots. Gideon's horse lifted its head, watching her come. Up close, he seemed even bigger. Not just height. Something in the way he held still, like he took up more space than most men and knew better than to waste it. His eyes found hers, steady, without pressing. No pity, no question. That, more than anything, made her stop. She stood a few feet from him, close enough to hear the leather of his saddle creak as the horse shifted, close enough to see the faint scar along his jaw, pale against the shadow. The wind dropped for a breath. "If you still want me," Nora said, her voice low, not carried beyond the space between them, "you should know why they sent me away." Gideon didn't answer right off. He looked at her the way a man looks at a stretch of land before deciding where to place his next step, not searching for weakness, just taking measure. A door slammed somewhere down the street. Laughter followed, then faded. He reached up, slow, and adjusted the brim of his hat against the wind. "I heard enough," he said. His voice was deep, even, not raised, not softened. Nora held his gaze a second longer, as if testing that answer for cracks. You don't know all of it. Don't need to, he said. The words settled between them, simple as they were. No promise in them. No offer dressed up as kindness. Just a line drawn where he stood. The horse stamped once, impatient with the cold. Gideon turned, took the reins, and held them out. Not to pull her forward, not to decide for her. Just there, within reach. Nora looked at his hand. Large, rough, steady. Then she shifted her bag, stepped past him, and placed her foot in the stirrup without asking. He didn't help her up, didn't touch her at all. But he stepped closer, just enough that if she slipped, she wouldn't hit the ground. She didn't. Once she settled into the saddle, he took the reins again and moved to his own horse. The motion was quiet, practiced, no wasted effort. They rode out without another word. Dry Creek fell behind them, lamps shrinking to dull glows, the road turning to packed dirt that stretched into open land. The wind eased once they cleared the last row of buildings, leaving only the steady rhythm of hooves and the faint jingle of tack. Nora kept her hands folded over the saddle horn. Her bag rested against her leg. She didn't look back. After a while, she said, "You don't have to take me in." Gideon rode a half-length ahead, eyes on the road. "I know. I can work," she added. "I didn't say you did." That stopped her. The moon slipped out from behind a cloud, casting the land in pale silver. Low hills rolled out ahead, scattered with scrub and stone. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once, then went quiet. They rode on. No bargain struck, no conditions set. Just two figures moving through the dark, leaving something behind neither of them turned to see. The ranch came into view near midnight. A small house, a barn set a little off to the side, a fence that had seen better years but still held its line. Gideon dismounted first, tying off his horse with a single loop. He didn't rush her. Nora climbed down on her own, boots hitting the dirt soft. The house stood quiet. No light in the windows. Gideon walked to the door, opened it, and stepped aside. Not inviting, not insisting. Just making space. Nora paused at the threshold. The air inside smelled faintly of wood and cold iron. A table, a stove, a chair pushed back like someone had left it that way without thinking. She stepped in. Behind her, the wind brushed past once more, then slipped away as the door closed. For the first time that night, there was no one telling her to leave. Only the quiet, and a man who hadn't asked her to stay, but hadn't walked away either. Morning came thin and pale over the valley, the kind of light that didn't hurry. It slipped through the window in a narrow band and settled across the floorboards, catching on dust that hadn't yet decided where to land. Nora was already awake. She sat at the edge of the narrow bed in the back room, boots set neatly beside the wall, her bag still closed. She hadn't unpacked. Not yet. The habit of leaving sat too close to the surface. From the front room came the slow scrape of iron on iron, a poker against the stove, then the dull thud of wood set into place. Gideon. No footsteps toward her door. No call to ask if she was awake. Just the sound of a man starting his day. Nora pulled on her boots and stepped out. The house looked different in daylight, smaller. Everything had its place. A table worn smooth at the edges, a tin cup turned upside down beside the basin. A coil of rope hung by the door, looped neat and tight. Gideon stood by the stove, sleeves rolled once at the forearms. The fire had already caught, a low, steady burn. A dented kettle rested on top, beginning to whisper. He glanced at her, then back to the stove. "There's water," he said. That was all. No good morning. No question about how she slept. Nora crossed to the basin. The water was cold enough to sting. She washed her hands, her face, the back of her neck where dust had settled overnight. When she turned, there was a cup set near the edge of the table. Steam rose from it. She paused. "I didn't hear you pour it," she said. Gideon shrugged once, like it wasn't worth the words. She picked it up. Coffee. Strong. No sugar. They stood in the same room, neither filling the quiet. After a while, Nora set the cup down and looked toward the door. "I'll need to find work." Gideon pulled on his coat, slow, one sleeve at a time. "There's always work," he said. Not for him. For her. She nodded once. Outside, the air still held the bite of night. The yard stretched wide and open, bordered by a fence that leaned in places but hadn't given up. A saddle rested over the rail, blanket folded beneath it. Tools lay near the barn wall, hammer, nails in a small tin, a saw with a worn handle. Gideon moved through it all like it belonged exactly where it was. A loose board near the porch shifted under Nora's step. She felt it give slightly, then settle. Gideon noticed. He didn't comment. Just bent, picked up the hammer, and moved to the step. One strike, then another, clean, measured. He stepped back, not looking at her. Nora tested it again. Solid. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, already moving away. By mid-morning, word had started its slow walk through Dry Creek. Martha Keene was the first to say it out loud. Nora stepped into the general store just past noon, the bell above the door giving a tired ring. The smell of flour and cured meat hung in the air. Martha stood behind the counter, arms folded, eyes sharp as ever. She took one look at Nora, then glanced toward the window like she expected to see Gideon's shadow out there. "So it's true," Martha said. Nora set a coin on the counter. "I need bandages. Clean cloth if you have it." Martha didn't move right away. "He bring you in last night?" "Yes." Martha reached under the counter, pulled out a bundle of cloth, set it down with more force than needed. "Town's already talking." "They usually are." "That man," Martha shook her head. "He don't do things halfway. You know that." Nora wrapped the cloth, tied it with a thin strip. "I'm not asking him to." Martha leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Whitaker won't like it. Not one bit." The name sat between them like something heavy. Nora picked up the bundle. "That doesn't concern me." "It will," Martha said. Nora didn't answer. On her way out, she passed a man sitting by the window, sleeve rolled, a rough bandage wrapped too tight around his forearm. The skin above it had gone pale. He looked up as she stopped. "That's cutting off your blood," she said. He blinked, surprised. "You a doctor?" "No." She set her bundle down, untied the cloth, and reached for his arm. He hesitated, then let her. Her fingers moved quick, sure. Loosened the wrap, adjusted it, tied it clean. "Try that," she said. He flexed his hand once. The color began to return. "Huh," he said. "That's better." Nora nodded, picked up her things and stepped back out into the wind. By the time she returned to the ranch, the sun had started its slow drop. Gideon was by the fence, tightening wire. His hands worked steady, pulling, securing, testing. She set her bundle on the table inside, then came back out. "There's a boy 2 miles east," she said, "running a fever. His mother doesn't have anything for it." Gideon didn't look up. "You going back?" "Yes." He nodded once. That was all the permission she got. She went. And when she returned, long after the light had gone and the stove had burned low, she found a plate on the table. Beans, bread, still warm. Gideon sat by the far wall, sharpening a blade, the slow scrape of metal filling the room. Nora ate without a word. Halfway through, she glanced up. You didn't ask where I was. He kept his eyes on the blade. You came back. The words landed quiet, but they stayed. Nora finished her meal, set the plate aside, and sat for a moment longer than she needed to. Outside, the wind had settled. The night held steady. Inside, nothing pressed, nothing demanded. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like something waiting to break. It felt like something holding. It held through the next few days. Morning came and went the same way. The kettle warmed. The fence got mended where it sagged. Nora moved in and out of the house without asking where to place her things. After the third day, her bag was no longer by the door. She hung her extra dress on a peg behind the kitchen wall. Gideon noticed. He didn't say anything. By the end of the week, the weather shifted. The wind came down colder, carrying something sharper than dust. By late afternoon, the sky pressed low and gray, the kind that made the land feel smaller. Nora stood at the edge of the yard, watching it gather. "That's coming in fast," she said. Gideon tightened the last knot on the fence wire and looked up once. "Yeah." That was all. By nightfall, the first snow came sideways. It didn't fall. It drove. The house took the wind in steady hits. Boards creaked. The stove burned higher than usual, the iron sides ticking as it held the heat. Nora wrapped a blanket tighter around her shoulders and sat near the table, mending a tear along the sleeve of one of Gideon's work shirts. The needle moved clean through the fabric, her hands steady even when the wind howled down the chimney. A knock came sometime past midnight. Not loud, not polite, urgent. Gideon was already on his feet before the second one. He opened the door against the push of the storm. Snow blew in hard across the floor. A man stood there, half covered in it, hat gone, breath coming fast. "Whitaker Place," the man said. "His boy's wife. She's been at it since sundown. Ain't right. She's not—" He swallowed. "She's not getting through it." The name hung there. Nora's hands stopped on the thread. The man looked past Gideon, saw her, and hesitated. "I didn't—" he started. "They said not to." Gideon didn't ask. He turned back inside, grabbed his coat, then looked at Nora. "Get your bag." No explanation, no argument, just that. Nora set the needle down. For a moment she stayed still, listening to the wind push against the walls. Then she stood. The bag came off the peg. She checked it quick. Cloth, scissors, the small glass bottle she kept wrapped tight. Everything in place. Outside, the cold hit like a wall. The horses shifted uneasy in the storm, breath steaming. Gideon moved fast but not rushed, saddling with practiced hands. Snow clung to his shoulders and didn't seem to bother him. He helped the other man mount, then turned to Nora. She climbed up on her own. They rode into it. The road to Whitaker's place was barely there under the snow. The wind flattened everything, erased the edges. Gideon rode ahead, leaning low, guiding his horse by memory more than sight. Nora followed close enough to see the shape of him through the white. No one spoke. By the time they reached the Whitaker house, the windows were lit, shadows moving inside. The door opened before they knocked. Warmth spilled out, along with the smell of sweat and fear. Inside, the room stilled when Nora stepped in. No one greeted her. A woman lay in the back room, sheets twisted tight in her fists. Her face was pale, eyes unfocused. Another woman stood nearby, wringing her hands, stepping back as Nora entered. Nora set her bag down. "Boil water," she said. No one moved. Gideon stepped into the room behind her. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there. A man near the stove shifted, then reached for the kettle. That was enough. Nora moved to the bedside. Her hands were already working, checking, adjusting, measuring what she could with what she had. The hours blurred. The storm didn't let up. The wind rattled the windows. The fire burned low, then was fed again. At one point, the woman cried out sharp and sudden, then went quiet in a way that made the room hold its breath. Nora didn't stop. Her sleeve brushed against sweat and blood. Her hands stayed steady. Once they trembled, just once, but she pressed them firm and kept going. "Stay with me," she said low. "Don't leave yet." The woman's fingers tightened weakly. Then, a sound. Thin at first, then stronger. A cry filled the room, cutting through everything else. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to fall back for a moment. Nora wrapped the child, checked the mother, her movements slowing only when she knew they were both through. She stepped back. Only then did she realize how tired her hands felt. The room came back to life in pieces. A chair scraped. Someone let out a breath they hadn't meant to hold. The man by the stove wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. No one thanked her, but no one turned away either. When Nora picked up her bag, no one tried to stop her. Outside, the storm still waited. The ride back felt longer. The cold had settled deeper now. The wind cut sharper across the open land. Nora held the reins tight, her fingers stiff beneath the gloves. Gideon rode beside her this time. Not ahead, not behind, just there. They didn't speak for a while. The only sound was the crunch of hooves through snow and the low push of the wind against their coats. Halfway back, Nora slowed. Gideon did too. She didn't look at him right away. "I was made to bring life," she said. Her voice carried strange in the open air. Not loud, but it didn't disappear either. Then, after a moment, "But I can't have one of my own." The words hung there. No storm strong enough to carry them off. Gideon didn't answer. He didn't reach for her. He didn't say anything at all. He just sat there in the saddle, steady, the same way he had when the man came to the door. After a while, Nora nodded once, like she'd said what needed saying. She turned her horse forward again. Gideon followed. The ranch came into view through the falling snow, dim and quiet, waiting the same way it had the night before. Only now, something between them had been set down in the open, and neither of them tried to cover it. The storm passed by morning, leaving the land quiet in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. Snow clung to the fence posts, softened the edges of everything. The world looked gentler than it was. Nora rose before the light had fully settled. She moved through the house without sound, adding wood to the stove, setting the kettle on. Her hands worked from habit, but her mind stayed somewhere else, out on the road, in the cold, where the words had left her and stayed. Gideon came in from the yard with snow still on his shoulders. He stamped his boots once at the door, then crossed inside. He didn't look at her right away. The kettle began to hum. "You should head back to town," Nora said. The words came out even, practiced. Gideon hung his coat, slow, deliberate. For what? She poured the water, watching the steam rise instead of him. "You've got a chance now," she said. "After last night." He waited. "The Whitakers won't forget who got them through it," she went on. "They'll be thinking different this morning." Gideon stepped closer to the table, resting his hand against the back of a chair. "And?" Nora set the cup down. "And they've got something you don't," she said. "Land, money, a future that makes sense." He didn't move. Nora finally looked at him. "You don't need to tie yourself to something that stops short," she said. "Not when you've got a way out standing right in front of you." The room held still. Gideon pulled the chair out and sat, like the conversation hadn't shifted the ground at all. "I'm not tied," he said. Nora let out a breath that didn't quite settle. "Then don't make it harder than it needs to be." A sound carried from outside. Hooves. More than one. Gideon turned his head slightly toward the door. Nora followed his gaze. They both knew. The riders didn't rush. They came in steady, controlled, the way men do when they expect to be heard before they speak. Gideon stood. By the time he opened the door, the men were already dismounting. Harold Whitaker stepped forward first, brushing snow from his coat like it had no right to be there. Two others stood behind him, quiet, watching. He took in the yard, the house, then Gideon. "Hell of a night," Whitaker said. Gideon didn't answer. Whitaker's eyes shifted, landing briefly on Nora in the doorway behind him, then back again. "My grandson's alive," he said. "My daughter-in-law, too." A pause. "That's worth something." Gideon leaned one shoulder lightly against the doorframe. "Good." Whitaker studied him a moment longer, like he was measuring where to begin. "I'll get straight to it," he said. "You're a man with land that don't stretch far enough. I'm a man with more than I can manage without the right help." Gideon didn't blink. Whitaker nodded once, as if confirming his own thought. "My daughter," he said. "She needs settling. You need backing. We could solve both problems in one go." The wind moved lightly through the yard, carrying the last of the storm with it. Nora stood still behind the door, her hand resting against the wood. She didn't step forward, didn't step away. Whitaker went on. "I'll clear your debts. Expand your range past the East Ridge. Put your name where it ought to be." He let that settle. "All you have to do is choose right." Gideon's gaze didn't shift. Behind him, Nora turned, moving back into the room. Not fast, not slow. She went to the small bedroom, closed the door halfway, and reached for her bag. The leather felt heavier than it had before. She folded her dress once, placed it inside. Her movements were careful, quiet, like she didn't want to disturb something that wasn't hers to hold. Outside, Whitaker's voice carried just enough. "You'd throw away everything for a woman who gives you nothing?" The words landed clean. Nora paused. Her hand stayed on the edge of the bag. For a moment, the room felt smaller than it had before. Then she closed the bag. In the front room, Gideon stepped off the doorframe. He walked out into the yard, boots pressing into the snow with a steady rhythm. He stopped a few feet from Whitaker, close enough to be heard without raising his voice. "I don't build a life on what I might get," he said. The words came low, even. "I build it on what I know is real." No anger, no show. Just the line, set where he stood. Whitaker's mouth tightened slightly. "You think that's enough?" he asked. Gideon didn't answer. He turned. Not away in retreat, just back toward the house. Whitaker watched him go, then looked past him toward the doorway, where Nora now stood again, her bag in hand. For a second, something like understanding crossed his face. Not approval, just recognition. He stepped back, signaling to the men behind him. "This isn't finished," he said. Gideon didn't turn around. The riders mounted, hooves breaking the crust of snow as they pulled away, the sound fading back toward town. Silence settled again. Nora stood in the doorway, the bag hanging at her side. Gideon reached the porch, stepped up, and stopped just inside. He moved past her into the house. Then he turned, his hand resting on the edge of the door. He held it open. Not wide, just enough. He didn't say a word, didn't ask her to stay, didn't tell her to go. Nora stood there, the cold still at her back, the warmth of the house just beyond the threshold. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she set the bag down and stepped inside. Gideon closed the door behind her. The latch settled with a soft click, quieter than it had any right to be. Nora stood just past the threshold, her hands empty now. The bag sat by the wall where she had set it down, no longer held like something ready to be taken again. Gideon moved back to the stove, added a piece of wood without looking at her. The fire caught slow, then steady. No one spoke. Outside, the snow began to melt under a thin break in the clouds. Water dripped from the edge of the roof in uneven rhythms, tapping against the frozen ground. Life returned in small sounds. That was how it went after. No agreement. No words set in place. Just mornings that came and found them both still there. Nora rose early, sometimes before Gideon, sometimes after. She learned the way the kettle sounded just before it boiled over. Learned which floorboard near the table creaked louder than the rest. She swept the dust that came back each afternoon, the way it always did, no matter how often you cleared it. Gideon worked the fence line, the barn, the stretch of land that never seemed to settle into being finished. Some days he spoke a few words, some days none at all. It didn't press. By the second week, people started coming. Not in groups, not announced. A man with a split knuckle who didn't want to go into town. A woman with a cough that hadn't eased. A boy who stood at the edge of the yard, hat twisting in his hands, asking if she could look at his mother. Nora never asked how they knew. She set water to boil, laid out cloth, did what needed doing. Gideon made space without saying it. If someone stayed too long, he stepped outside. If the room filled, he leaned against the far wall, silent, present enough that no one forgot where they were. At night, the house settled again. One evening, Nora sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cool. Gideon came in late, shoulders dusted with dirt instead of snow this time. He set his gloves by the door and crossed to the basin, washing his hands slow, careful. She watched the water run over his fingers. "You didn't have to say that," she said. He dried his hands on a cloth, then set it aside. "Say what?" "Back there," she said, "to Whitaker." He looked at her then, just for a moment. "I know." She let out a breath that didn't quite carry all the way through. "I meant what I said," she added, "about not wanting to be something that holds you short." Gideon walked to the table, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat. The wood creaked under his weight. "I don't feel held," he said. That was all. No reassurance dressed up larger than it needed to be. Nora nodded once. The quiet returned, but it didn't settle the same way it used to. It stayed open. Spring came slow. The snow pulled back in patches, leaving the ground damp and dark. The road to town softened, wagon tracks sinking deeper with each pass. One morning, Nora stood by the basin, pouring water into a cup. Her hand slipped. Not much. Just enough that the water tipped over the edge, running across her fingers and onto the table. She stilled, looked down at her hand, like it had done something unfamiliar. Gideon noticed from the doorway. "You all right?" he asked. Nora nodded, wiping the water with a cloth. "Just didn't hold it right." He watched her a second longer, then stepped outside. She didn't think much of it. Not then. But the next day, it happened again. And the day after that, she woke with a weight in her stomach that didn't feel like hunger. She didn't say anything. Instead, she rode into town alone. The doctor's office sat at the far end of Main Street, a narrow building with a window that caught the light in the afternoon. A different man worked there now, younger, quieter. He asked questions she answered plain. He checked what he needed to check. Then he sat back, hands folded, choosing his words like they mattered. "I can't promise anything certain," he said. "But there are signs." Nora didn't move. "What kind of signs?" He met her eyes. "The kind that don't always show up when they're supposed to," he said. "But sometimes do anyway." The room felt smaller for a moment, then wider. She thanked him, paid what she owed, left without rushing. By the time she reached the ranch again, the sun had dropped low, laying long shadows across the yard. Gideon was at the fence, pulling a line taut. He looked up when he heard her horse. Didn't ask where she'd been. She stepped down, tied the reins, and stood there for a moment. The words sat with her, not ready yet. She walked inside, set a cup on the table. When Gideon came in later, he moved the same way he always did. Coat off, hands washed, a glance toward her that stayed just long enough. Nora sat down, placed her hand flat on the table. He noticed, walked over, and without asking, without pressing, he set his hand over hers. Warm, steady, no questions, no need for them. Outside, the wind moved soft through the open land. Inside, the house held. There wasn't any moment where things were declared finished. No grand line spoken to mark the end of one life and the start of another. It came together the way most things do out there. Quiet, piece by piece, until one day you realize nothing feels the way it used to. Nora no longer stood by doors waiting to be told where she belonged. She moved through that house like someone who had chosen it. And Gideon, he never asked her to become anything more than she already was. He never tried to fix what had been taken from her. He just stayed. Steady as the land under his boots. Out there, people built lives on cattle, on weather, on luck. But the ones that lasted were built on something harder to name. A kind of knowing. A kind of choosing that didn't shift when things turned uncertain. Maybe that's what this story leaves behind. Not that love fills every empty space, but that sometimes it makes the empty spaces easier to carry. And maybe the real question is this. If you were standing where Nora once stood, would you have walked away or stepped inside? If stories like this stay with you, there's a place here for more of them. Quiet ones, hard ones, the kind that don't rush, but don't let go easy either.